It's nice to be here. I've had several comments on the fact that I'm in a colored coat. Yes, I typically wear earth tones. I might be a little colorblind, or at least I see on a different color spectrum. And so my wife and I often debate what color things are. So she picks out my wardrobe. I had picked out some stuff I was going to wear at CYC. She came in from school and redid the thing. And that's what happens when you have a wife and a daughter. I've been in private practice by the grace of God 21 years. Rented the same office there on South Parkway for 20 years. And I'm a guy, so stuff like that doesn't really mean anything to me. I got a file cabinet a couple of years ago. I need to expand my files. I was going to put in the office, eventually move to bookcases and put but I got used to the file cabinet being behind my desk. It was very convenient to put things on, empty boxes, loose papers. I'm sitting there one day during the summer, and my grown daughter comes into town. She lives in Georgia, but she was there doing a photo shoot. She popped in the office. She goes, "Hey, Dad, when's the last time Mom was here?" I said, "Baby, your mother doesn't come down here. She respects people's privacy. She can just pop into my office anytime." She goes, and walks out. 6 days later, Jackie shows up. "Oh, I was just in town shopping." And walks out. Then this little bitty love seat shows up at the house. A new coffee table shows up. I said, "Are we redecorating the house?" She goes, "No, you're redoing your office." So after 21 years, I've got a new office. So that's what happens when you have a wife and a daughter. They dress you, they decorate your office, and you don't get to vote. Last year on my birthday, she came into town, and I told them where I wanted to eat for my birthday, and they said I was wrong. And so I don't know what. Anyway, Jackie's responsible for this. If you are friends with her on Facebook or Twittergram or Instaface or whatever, tell her she did a good job and keep me out of the doghouse. If you have your Bibles, look at the book of Numbers 13. The children of Israel had been headed toward a destination. They left Egypt after their nation had been there 430 years. 430 years to the day that Joseph's people moved into the land of Goshen. 430 days to the day they walk out. And they're going to an inheritance that God had promised them. And they get there and it's theirs for the taking. But it's almost like they're shocked. It's almost like they're unprepared that we've gone from being slaves to being nomads to now we're going to be an invading force in this land. And so they say, well, before we make this commitment, let's explore. Let's send some guys into this land and let's check this out. Now they take 12 guys, one leader from each tribe, and they send them into the land. As best as I understand it, and with a little bit of help from some other guys, this is a 40-day trip and probably 150 miles. And so in 40 days, they do 150 miles, and they're living off the land. I wish that was about 9 chapters in the Bible. The adventures of the 40. Now, we call them spies. Think rangers. Guys like Lewis and Clark, they're going in and checking this place out. If you've got a land that has plenty of fruit, you've got animals that eat fruit. If you've got animals that eat fruit, you've got animals that eat fruit. So you've got wild animals, you've got predators, you've got prey, you've got the people here. You're an invading force, you're a trespasser, and these 12 guys live for 40 days off the land. If you're in Lads to Leaders, the founder of Lads to Leaders, Brother Jack Zorn, a dear friend of mine, and his daughter Rhonda, one of his daughters Rhonda, and I grew up together. She and Jackie are partners in crime. They're kind of the Thelma and Louise of the church, and they run around and do stuff. Rhonda's husband Halo left Monday morning in this rain to walk the Appalachian Trail. He went into Springer Mountain, Georgia, and 6 months later he's going to emerge at the end of the AT. I think somewhere 3,000-mile hike, I don't know. But he gets to leave the trail and go to these resupply stations. He gets to leave the trail and maybe stay at a hostel. he can do, I'm not taking anything away from what he's doing. By the time he walks where he's going to walk, the elevation gain and loss, he'll have climbed Everest 16 times. So he's taken on a monumental task. Please pray for Halo Fernandez while he's out there on his own doing this thing. But these guys don't have a trail. They probably don't even have a map. They're going into this wilderness area, looking at the animals, looking at the fruit, and dealing with the people that God has given them. And they come back with this report. Numbers chapter 13, let's start at verse 26. Oh, let's start in 23. Then they came to the valley of Eshcol, and there they cut down a branch with one cluster of grapes, and they carried it between the two of them on a pole. So they're walking around with a cluster of grapes that it takes two guys to carry. Now, I don't know if there's that many grapes or like they're the size of softballs. I love grapes. We like to have a grape the size of like a softball. Anyway. So they brought some of the pomegranates and the figs. The place was called the Valley of Eshcol because the cluster of the men that the grapes cut down there, Eshcol I think is a variant of a name that means harvest time because it was the time of gathering grapes. It may even mean cluster. And they returned from spying out the land after 40 days. Verse 26, and now they departed and came back to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the children of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. And they brought back word to them and told all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. And then they told him, we went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey. And this is its fruit. So these guys come back from this exploration and they say, man, the place you sent us really flows with milk and honey. I don't know if you've ever thought of it. I love honey. It's one of my favorite treats. I'm really not supposed to have sugar, but I can eat some of the natural sugars and it's not a big deal. I had one of those little honey bears. I was putting it in my oatmeal and putting it in my pancakes, putting it on my waffles, putting it on peanut butter sandwiches, putting it on apples. I was eating a little bit of honey. Well, Jackie would say, you've been in the honey again, haven't you? I said, why do you know I've been in the honey? She said, it makes you grouchy because you get too much sugar. I said, no, the honey doesn't bother me. Well, she didn't believe me. So I bought me some sugar-free honey at Walmart. And when I ran out of sugar-free honey, I went and bought me another little bear and changed the contents. I kept the sugar-free bottle but was using the real stuff, okay? And I got away with it for a little while. And again, Lonnie Beth is home, and she says something, and we're in some kind of discussion. And I said, you're not really being honest. She goes, you want to talk about honest? You got little honey bears buried in the backyard like a serial killer. And I don't. So I go out for a run one morning. I come back from my run, and it's hot. I'm sitting outside beside our blueberry bushes, and the bees are everywhere. I call my dad. I'm talking to my dad while I'm cooling off. I said, Dad, I can't even hardly hear you speak because of the bees. He goes, you got an unusual amount of honeybees on your blueberry? Yes, sir. He goes, you got a hive nearby. I said, really? He goes, yeah. He said, I used to find them when I was a boy living on the farm. He said, go get you like a tablespoon of flour and pick out one of those bees and dust him. And then when he flies off, time him. In a little while, you'll get the white bee will come back. And he says, you can tell how far away the hive is by how long it takes him to come back. He said, and you've heard the phrase a beeline? Well, bees fly from where they are back to their hive in a straight azimuth. It's a straight line. He said, just start walking that straight line. He said, eventually you'll get a bunch of bee traffic. And within about 2 miles of my house, I find this honeycomb. It's in the wall of an old abandoned church building. And in the summertime, when it's really, really hot, the honey will ooze out of the walls. A land that flows with milk and with honey. And look at the fruit. So they show these. Doesn't your mouth just water? Think about that honey and that fruit. And they're showing the people all this good stuff. Verse 28, nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in this land to the south. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the mountains. The Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the banks of the Jordan. Now Caleb quieted the people. said, "Let us go up at once and take possession, for we are able to overcome it." But the men who had gone with him said, "We are not able to go against these people, for they are stronger than we." And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they'd spied out. "The land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people whom we saw are men of great stature. There we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak, come from the giants. And we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." So you get this mixed report. Oh, it's beautiful. It's great. There's plenty of food. There's plenty of game. But the people are huge. And the cities are fortified. And the land is so harsh, it devours the inhabitants. Well, if it devours the inhabitants, how do they grow so big? Or maybe he's saying, as Dale pointed out, it is such a tough land that it even devours the giants. Later on, when they talk about this, they'll go from being giants to being Nephilim, a word that's unfortunately translated like that in the King James, and it makes you think of a mythical creature. They go from being big dudes to being heffalumps and woozles, and they go, we can't take it. And this verse, in verse 33, we saw ourselves as grasshoppers, and that's how they saw us. We're small, they're big, they're strong, we're weak, we're insecure. You know what they were describing, right? We were ashamed. We were inadequate. We were insecure. Now, they've been given this promise from God. They've been given this gift. And they bring back the fruit and the game, and look how... But they focus more on those people than on their God. And they compare people with themselves rather than comparing their enemies with their God. And they act like a bunch of people who are ashamed. They're insecure and they're frightened. And they exaggerate their fears. They're giants, they're Nephilim. And then Caleb has a talk with them. And he tries to convince them to live differently. He calls them out on their faithlessness. Numbers chapter 14, verse 6. "And Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes. And they spoke to the congregation of the children of Israel and said, 'The land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only,'" now listen at the points here, "do not rebel against the Lord. Do not fear the people of the land. They are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." Caleb said, look, don't rebel. Being ashamed causes us to be insecure, which causes us to act weak and causes us not to obey. And lack of obedience is rebellion. Caleb says, don't rebel. Number 2, Caleb says, don't fear these people. They are our bread. The land not going to devour us. We're going to go in, we're going to devour them. We're going to consume them. We're going to overpower them. Their protection has gone, but our protection comes from God. Don't be afraid of these people. Let's do what God brought us here to do. Let's not be ashamed. When you leave here, what did God bring you here to do? To be taught, to be trained, to be encouraged, to be inspired. And so when you go home, don't make excuses about what they think or what they'll do. And go home and do what God has brought you here to do. And don't be ashamed. Verse 10, and all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Caleb calls them out for being unfaithful. Caleb calls them out for being ashamed. And when he challenges them with, this is what you're thinking, but this is the truth, the people decide that they're going to just shut Joshua and Caleb up and stone them with stones. Hurt people. People who are insecure and frightened act angry and aggressive. And a lot of times when we encounter people and we challenge them about their faithlessness, or we challenge them about things that they should do different, they're going to react with hostility. Anytime you encounter hostility and aggression from someone, you've run into somebody who's very, very insecure. You've run into somebody who's very, very frightened. You've run into somebody who essentially is ashamed. Because hurt people hurt people. And when people treat you bad and people treat you angry and people treat you with contempt, that's not saying anything about you. It's saying a lot of things about them. And so Caleb calls these people out. He's unashamed to tell them, you're behaving in a way that proves you don't trust God. You're behaving in a way that says you don't believe in the purpose that God has brought you here. And in fact, when we listen to what God had done for these people, in Deuteronomy chapter 1, there's kind of a review. These are the things you need to know that God had. Deuteronomy chapter 1, they review how you've behaved, and then there's this really cool section where they talk about how God has behaved. Verse 29 of Deuteronomy chapter 1. Then I said to you, he's reviewing the story. Then I said to you, do not be terrified or afraid of them. The Lord your God who goes before you, he will fight for you according to all that he did in Egypt before your eyes. First point. Do you remember the stories of when you were captives in Egypt and God brought you out with 10 plagues and parted the Red Sea and fed you with quail and fed you with manna? Hey, you decide what you're going to do in the future based on what you've seen God do in the past. These people were eyewitnesses of the power of God, and now all of a sudden they want to let these big people in these fortified cities in this scary land keep them from doing what God told them they're supposed to do. And in the wilderness, verse 31, what God did for you with the Egyptians, and in the wilderness where you saw the Lord your God carried you as a man carries his son, and all the way you went until you came to this place. Yet for all that you did not believe the Lord your God, who went in the way before you to search out a place for you, to pitch your tents and to show you where you should go, in fire by night and in a cloud by day. He says, look, don't be afraid of these people. Don't be afraid. Don't be ashamed to do what God's asked you to do. Look what God did with the Egyptians. Look what God did in the wilderness. When you went through that terrible wilderness, God carried you as a man carries his son on his shoulders. You remember being carried on your dad's shoulders? My wife coached softball. She coaches volleyball now. But a long time ago when we were younger, she coached softball at this little place near Meridianville. Had a little ballpark. And the ballpark was built in this open field, and the open field sloped down, and it went into some property owned by Mary Ann Smith. And at the bottom of that hill was a spring. The beavers had dammed up the spring and flooded about 8 acres and made a little, well, I call it the swamp. It was water about this deep, crystal clear, sandy bottom. Watercress grew in it. Trees grew in it. And you could wade in that water and catch bass. I mean, like a champ, you could catch a bass. So she would coach softball, and I know nothing about softball. I didn't play traditional sports. So when she's coaching softball, I go wade in the swamp and catch bass. Well, then we have a daughter, and now I've got rugrat duty. So she's coaching softball, and I've got to deal with the bleacher creature. Well, I decided that I might as well take her fishing with me. Now, I used to take her fishing all the time. I kept one of those little plastic seats in my truck. And I'd drive out to some place I wanted to fish, and I'd shoot a line over a tree limb, and I'd pull that swing in the air. I'd stick her in it. I'd put a line to her and a line to me. I'd stand on the creek bank and fish, and I'd pull that string, and she would swing, and I would fish. We had lots of good adventures. She's mostly napping. I'm catching fish. Well, you can't do that in the swamp because you got to move around. So I bought her a Snoopy life jacket and put her on my shoulders and waded out into the swamp with her and was catching bass like a champ. And I would tell her, honey, I got a bite, hang on. She'd hold my ears, and I'd set the hook, her little feet would come up. She'd yell, roll him up, Daddy, and we out there in the swamp. I'm wearing an inverted shoulder holster with a .357 Magnum in it. Lonnie, that was irresponsible taking that baby down there in that swamp. That baby was the safest baby on this planet. Because she was on my shoulders. She was on her dad's shoulders. God carried you like a man carries his son. And he went before you in the wilderness, and he picked out the places you're supposed to camp. He showed you where to pitch your tent. In the day, he led you with a cloud, and at night, there was a pillar of fire. He gave you a night light in the wilderness. And you're not going to trust him? You're not going to obey him? Look at Deuteronomy chapter 6. This is the one that gets me. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 10. So it shall be, when the Lord your God brings you into the land of which he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you large and beautiful cities which you did not build, houses full of good things which you did not fill, hewn out wells which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant. He said, listen, I'm bringing you into a place and it's already pre-done. It's furnished. You're going to live in tents in the wilderness, and then you're going to move into a place, and their cities are big. They built them for you. Their houses are furnished. They furnished them for you. You're not going to have to go in and homestead. You're going to walk in. There's going to be a well with water and a bucket, and you'll be able to drink water right then, right there. You'll be able to walk in and pick fruit off trees you didn't plant. When these people were recovering the land of Canaan from the famine that ran Joseph's family from there back to Egypt 430 years ago, ever since the Israelites left, these people have been building cities and houses and putting nice things in them and digging wells and planting trees so God's kids could have them. God said, they didn't build houses for themselves. They built houses for you. They didn't build cities for themselves. They built them for you. When they dug their wells and they planted their vineyards, they were planting them for you because I was going to give them to you. Before they put the curbs and the sidewalks in your neighborhood, God gave it to you. If I get one Christian to move in that neighborhood and they'll evangelize it and be unashamed and take it, I'll give it to you. Before they pick the logo for your team, God gave that school to you. If I get one Christian on one team to say, hey, I'm God's man, I'm not ashamed, to make that confession. Before they did the charter for the business you work at, gentlemen, they gave the business to you because God said, if I can send one Christian in there who'll be unashamed and take it, I'll give it to them. But what happens? We compare ourselves to them. We're not big, we're not strong, we're weak, we're insecure. We use all kind of phrases. But did you notice what he said in Deuteronomy chapter 1? But for all this, you did not believe. Look at Hebrews. The Hebrew writer sums up their rebellion. And in summing up their rebellion, he talks about fear and faithlessness. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 16, talking about this group of people who, having heard, rebelled. Indeed, was it not all who came out of Egypt led by Moses? Now with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose corpses fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who did not obey? So you see that they could not enter because of unbelief. Oh, you talk about I'm afraid. You talk about I'm scared. You can talk about I'm insecure. You can talk about I'm weak. You can talk about I'm ashamed. The Bible writer says, no, it all boils down to one thing: you don't believe. And the difference in being ashamed and being unashamed is basically a question of faith. And Caleb called out that group of people on their faithlessness. And I'm challenging you to understand that when you go home and you are ashamed, what you're really saying is, I don't believe. When you don't do what God's asked you to do, and when you don't perform according to the promises God has given you, whatever you want to call it, scared, insecure, timid, hesitant, ashamed, the Bible says it's basically unbelief. Romans chapter 9, verse 33. Behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be ashamed. Now, what that verse really says is they'll not be put to shame. And the original intent of that passage that he's quoting is that if you put your trust in God, God will never disappoint you. God will never let you down. You never have to be ashamed because of what God has done. But you could really re-emphasize it and say, if you believe, you'll never be ashamed. You'll never act ashamed. You'll never behave ashamed. You'll never hesitate because you're ashamed. But it really boils down to belief. And if you are ashamed and you don't teach and you don't talk and you don't stand up and you don't serve and you don't minister, then you don't believe. Those who put their belief in him will not be ashamed. And if you're not ashamed, then you believe. And if you don't believe, then you're ashamed. James says it this way. In James chapter 2, he talks about you got to treat people better than you're treating them. You can't judge people based on what they wear. You can't treat a rich guy this way and a poor guy this way. And you've got to be humble with one another. And as he continues that discussion in James chapter 2, verse 14, he says, and what does it profit, my brethren, if a man says he has faith, but does not have deeds? Can faith save him? Well, what James is saying is, if you claim this, if you say this about God, if you spend a weekend talking about being unashamed, but you don't do anything with it, if your faith doesn't produce obedience, repentance, confession, baptism, if your faith doesn't produce lifestyle change, if your faith doesn't produce purity, if your faith doesn't produce love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, if your faith doesn't produce something that we can observe in your life, then you don't have faith. And you're ashamed. I've got a bunch of T-shirts that I get because I wear them when I'm with the other SWAT team. I'm a chaplain with a bunch of guys that are tactical officers. And some of the shirts I actually drew the design on the front, but the design on the back is a triangle. The triangle has a sword coming through it, and there's speed, shock, and surprise on the three sides of the triangle. Now, that's from the British SAS. And the British SAS say speed, shock, and the overwhelming presence of violence. And we can't do that. We're politically correct, so we do speed, shock, and surprise. But when you read surprise, it's the overwhelming action of violence. That's what our shirt said. But in the middle of the shirt are these words, acta non verba. Acta non verba. We were walking around one day and all of us were kind of strolling and we had our shirts on. A guy came up behind us and was reading the back of our shirts. He says, actions are verbs? Yeah, okay. Acta non verba means deeds, not words. What good is it, my friends, if you say you have faith and do not have works? Deeds, not words. We sing about unashamed. We listen to lessons about unashamed. We wear T-shirts that say unashamed. But what good does it do us if we say those things but do not do those things? Deeds, not words. Are you going to leave here unashamed? All we have to do is sit back and watch. Because when you leave here and you go back to school and you go back to work and you go back to the teams and you go back to the bands and you go back to the clubs and you go back to all those things you participate, we'll just sit back and watch. And we'll know whether or not you're ashamed or whether or not you're unashamed. Because if you're unashamed, we'll see deeds, not words. We'll see actions, not verbiage. We'll see you serve. We'll see you teach. We'll see you care. We'll see you evangelize. We'll see you help. We'll see you witness. Deeds, not words. It may be that you've reached a point this weekend where you say, you know what, I need to change my deeds. And one of the deeds I need to do is I need to make a heart change. You can make a heart change sitting in your seat. You also can make a heart change walking up here and asking us to pray for you and your heart change. You can come forward based on your faith and say, I'm going to do some deeds. I'm going to repent. I'm going to confess and I'm going to be baptized. We'll know whether or not this weekend meant anything to you. All we got to do is sit and watch you. And we'll see deeds, not words. Show me some deeds, not words, while we stand, while we sing.